Recording now.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you, everyone, for week 2 of the Multispecies Studio. If you took a look at the readings, you know that this week we're going to talk about planetary thinking, but in particular, we're going to talk about time and how time is uh, a category through which we can look at our experience right now, our experience as historical beings, and of course, geological time, which is a new entrant, but one, of course, that's been around for a very long time. Week 2 of the Multispecies Studio, therefore, will concentrate on our understanding of time and bring geological time in a substantial way into our understanding of urban life and of Shaktiville in particular. That's the goal for today. Couple of things before we start. Today's session will, again, like last time, have a lecture component, and where I hope Sartaj and Anshuman keep me on time. So let's say by 4:50 latest IST, I should stop. Right, so give me a 10-minute warning and then a 5-minute warning. So I'm going to lecture for that period, and then we'll break for the creative exercise, and then we'll be back and we'll do Q&A, and then we'll be done. That's the broad idea. Okay, time. What's the big challenge here? So this presentation is going to have lots of quotes. If you've read the readings, you probably will recognize some of those quotes. And I'm not going to read everything that is there on the page. You can read along with me, but I'm going to point out some of the things. So it's a little bit of a humanities type presentation combined with a science presentation. In the humanities, if you've been trained, in a humanities seminar, people actually just read out of their papers. And scientists, of course, do PowerPoint or other presentations. So this is a big difference between the two communities. Today, we're going to do a combination. What Marcia Bjornerud points out is the difficulty of studying the Earth. She says that the Earth is an elusive subject to study because we are in it, we are off it, we are on it. So it's really close to us, but it's also really big and far, especially geological time is quite removed from our daily experience, right? So the Earth can't be viewed through one lens or reduced to one experiment. Any imagination of the Earth is tied to our own myths and dreams and hopes and everything. How do we grasp the planet? What is the right way, if there's not one right way, but maybe there are many right ways, but what's the appropriate way to understand the planet? And in particular, how do we understand that in time? That's the big task, not just for this seminar, but for all of us alive right now. The news flash really is that there's no one Earth to study, right? This might be a little jarring because, after all, there's exactly one planet. So why is the Earth not one? The 3 points of view, one as an inhabitant, the other as an astronaut, and finally the third as the God's eye view that the scientist is supposed to have. These are actually quite different perspectives of the planet. If we spend a little bit more time, I'm sure we'll come up with quite a few more. And let's not assume that these perspectives give you the same insights or are fully aligned with each other. They may not be. So we should be ready for some contradictions in our grasp of what the Earth itself is. Right. And that's where the reading for this week actually is quite interesting, because we have a crisis of multiple views of our life on this planet. One specific crisis that Yaneti brings out is the fact that at least some of us, maybe many of us, don't trust experts. We think that experts have their own political agenda as opposed to perhaps trying to, again, in a flawed human way, getting to the truth of the matter. And especially when you have in the United States in particular, half the population thinking that some of the biggest changes that are happening are actually unreal or fake, you have a huge problem, right? So, what can we do about this? And in particular, how can a synthetic exercise like Shakti become a response to these crises? That's where we are at today. And I'm going to end with a challenge from Achille Bembe, which is that more than in any other time in our brief history on Earth, we are experiencing a clash of temporalities, right? Geological time, the deep time of those processes that fashioned our terrestrial home, historical and experiential time. And these times actually fold into one another. One disadvantage of thinking of geological time is that it may appear to be so distant or so awesome that nothing we do today can matter. But maybe Bembe gives us an opportunity, right? Just as experiential time is folded into historical time and that in turn into the deep geological time, we can also unfold those. And hopefully, we have a sense for our responsibility, not just for our experience or even of history, but also of geology, right? And that's why this is more than a matter of scale. It's not just that experience happens in hours or days, history happens in years and centuries, while geology happens in millennia and more, right? It's that actually these three ways of presenting time are actually quite different. One is the first person subjective experience of the here and now. The second is tied to at least family and national and cultural history. But geology feels very remote from it. We don't actually see rocks change in front of us. Though, if you're a good reader of rocks, you can see that they're clearly shaped by forces that must have affected them at some point or the other. How do we align these three? That's what Björnerud is trying to do in her book. And so let's start with a little bit of inspiration from our readings for this week. What I really liked about style of writing, but also how she thinks of the discipline of geology. It demanded a type of whole brain thinking I hadn't encountered before. It creatively appropriated ideas from physics and chemistry for the investigation of unruly volcanoes and oceans and ice sheets. It applied scholarly habits one associates with the study of literature and the arts, the practice of close reading, sensitivity to allusion and analogy, capacity for spatial visualization to the examination of rocks, which is to say that there is a way of partly being a humanist and partly being a natural scientist, and you bring both of those together, which is why the arts of illustration work quite well in geology, being able to see the world as a geologist and not just think it. So, can we learn to think geologically and not just about rocks? How do we learn to think geologically about cities? This is where I want to bring in synthetic philosophy. We are trying to create an artifact, Shaktiville, an outcome of this seminar. A very good paper by Eric Schleicher from 2019 it says synthetic philosophy, which shares kinship with what was once known as natural philosophy or later philosophy of nature, is made possible and a response to the intellectual division of labor within and among the scientific disciplines. It requires skills that are orthogonal to the increasing specialization within the increasingly esoteric sciences. It is thus a modern phenomenon of the last 2 centuries. So again, Schleicher as a philosopher is trying to codify what Björnerud says intuitively, right? That to do geology, you need to integrate different ways of thinking. Can we bring philosophy as the connective tissue that helps us be interdisciplinary? Schleicher has more to say about this, right? How do we make philosophy the connective tissue? He says it brings together insights, knowledge, and arguments from the special sciences. The one thing he adds is that the way you bring together those special sciences is through some kind of general theory that works across the various subdisciplines. It could be something like information theory, Darwinian evolutionary theory, or Bayesian analysis. So things that are very Flexible, lightweight, can be applied in different situations. But of course, when applied, it's a rich enough mode of application that you get insights. So this is what Schleicher's thinks is the way to do synthetic philosophy. We're going to replace his requirement of a general theory with a general artifact, right? Instead of the theory being the thing that glues things together, we are creating an artifact that glues things together. That's what this theory is about. So with that thought, I'm going to move to the discussion of time. Ionetti says that in the Anthropocene, we are a geological force. I mean, it's not just Ionetti's claim, it's actually from the very definition of the Anthropocene, right? So the idea of the Anthropocene, or the idea of saying that we are in the age of human dominance, if it's actually a geological label, it's because we are a geological force, right? So if we are literally a force of nature, then the question is how to become more open to deeper timescales. The challenge is to learn to inhabit a longer now. I think this is the answer to the question of how do we stop ourselves from feeling overwhelmed or inadequate to geological time. People have done that with religion. Maybe we need to inhabit the longer now by borrowing from what religions have done in the past, but also combine scientific insights that are very recent. We cannot deny the gloomy reality that, from the perspective of millions of years, the duration of our lived experience appears utterly inconsequential. However, we cannot feel paralyzed by the seeming insignificance of human purposes with an immense time span of the universe. How do we grasp the long now so it energizes us rather than making us apathetic or overwhelmed? Hard problem. I don't think there's some easy answer to it, but I think we need to do it. Hopefully, we'll do it together. Um, just as the microscope and the telescope extended our vision into spatial realms, once too minuscule or too immense for us to see, geology provides a lens through which we can witness time in a way that transcends the limits of our human experiences. One kind of specific hypothesis is let's learn how to think geologically. If we do, and especially if we incorporate geological time into our self understanding, into the stories we tell about ourselves, maybe we won't feel overwhelmed, or rather, we'll feel energized and we'll feel the capacity to make the changes that we need to, right? We will think in the very long term. And that kind of ancestral thinking, there's a kind of ancestral thinking which says, you hear it all the time when people talk about climate change, that we can't destroy the world for our children or our grandchildren. But I think geological ancestral thinking would be like, we can't destroy the world for species that will come 25,000 years from now. I think that's a kind of long now that I think will be even more important than what we're going to do for our children or our grandchildren. What are the instruments like the microscope and the telescope that will help us make that long now real? I think the computer has something to do with it. Like we cannot look into the future 20,000, 20 million, 200 million years from now without having computing capacity that makes that future tangible to us. Right. But time is a very difficult thing to grasp. Like what Marcia Bjornerud says very early in her book. She says that if you go out when it just freshly snowed, so instead of snow, let's just say rain, right? Steady rain. Right? It has the quality of like it because it adds a layer to our visual experience. It has a time stopping capacity to it, or a time slowing, I should say, not stopping. And that has to do both with the sight and sound of rain, in her case, snow. And so it changes the way we perceive the world. What I'm seeing in her writing is that there are moments when geology actually inserts itself into your experience, which might be an opportunity to expand into geological time. Right? It's the counterpart of what mystics in many religions would say is an experience of some transcendental reality. Can we, instead of a transcendental reality, use this form of meditation as a geological reality, so to speak? But at the same time, geology also shows you uh, a world that has little memory of humans. This impression is not of timelessness, but of timefulness, acute consciousness of how the world is made, indeed made of time. And so, how to imagine and model time, not just as a marker, like not just as a clock where you go 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, or a container, something that says in 399 BC, Socrates was killed, or in 1947, India got independence. That's the container model of time. It's like stuff happens along this axis. But as an active, as an agent, as something that constitutes objects and events, that's a very powerful idea of time. And again, something that we are rarely taught how to incorporate into our own imagination. This is what Bjorner says. Most humans, including those in affluent and technically advanced countries, have no sense of temporal proportion. The durations of the great chapters in Earth's history, the rates of change during previous intervals of environmental instability, the intrinsic timescales of natural capital, like groundwater systems. There are many people who have that sense for, say, money. If you have to create a business, you may have an instinctive feel of what is the profit or what are the costs of the various inputs and outputs. But we don't seem to have that kind of grasp on natural processes. We are much better about human history. It leads to all kinds of fake news and fake history, but I think most of us who are reasonably well educated have a sense for how history inserts itself into our lives. But we don't have too much planetary consciousness, and that needs to change. This ignorance of planetary history undermines any claims we may make to modernity. This is Marcia Bjornerud's strong claim. We are navigating recklessly towards our future using conceptions as primitive as a world map from the 14th century. Right? The dragons of time denial still persist. The flip side, which I actually took this paragraph as an optimistic one, is that modernity, which really gave us historical consciousness, should be succeeded by, I don't want to call it postmodernity, that's got a very specific connotation to it, but whatever comes after modernity, which we can call planetarity, should bring geological time into our consciousness, just as historical time is, is something that we all share now. Of course, that's hard because, if anything, our current consumption based systems fracture our attention, make us even more focused on immediate gratification. That's a real problem. We have to do something about it. Right? And as she says, consumer has become more or less a synonym for citizen. But citizen implies engagement, contribution, give and take. Consumer suggests only taking, as if our role is to devour everything in sight. Hopefully, we won't be like that for long. That famous claim that indefinite growth is the theory of the cancer cell. You keep hearing that. Let's not be cancer cells. A naive hope might be that understanding geology is a way to unite us. It's a really naive hope. I can't say that, you know, giving everybody education in geology will suddenly bring us together, but it's the kind of hope we need, right? And if there are educational tools that can genuinely give us the way to expand our consciousness, why shouldn't we do it? And that's where cities become really important. Okay. We are already a majority urban species. By 2050, it looks like 70% will live in urban areas. Can architects, engineers, urban planners, computer scientists, and infrastructure builders design smarter cities to adapt to this influx? Right. But I actually think he's underestimating the urban experience. even if you're in a village, like Sataj right now is outside Batala. He's also on Zoom webinar. He's having an urban experience in a non-urban setting. In that sense, I feel like the colonization of the planet by the city is pretty much complete. You can't escape it, even if you're in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. It feels the urban condition is imperialist in a way that we simply can't avoid wherever we are. So, if that is the case, then how can we liberate the city by bringing in some geological time into it? That's kind of the last thing I want to talk about today. All right. So, how can we make our cities timeful? If you looked at the prompt that Sataj had shared, most Indian cities are very new. I heard this shocking statistic once, which is that Bangalore did an expansion plan or a population growth plan in the 1960s. And already by 1990 or so, it was clear that they were off by a factor of 20. Right, so there are 20 times more people came to Bangalore between 60 and 90 than people expected. So most Indian cities are new. Our urban experience is very much that of non-geological time. It's like we are constantly hustling in uh, consumption time. Can we make our cities more timeful? How can we imagine them so that our everyday experience, our sense of history, and deep history can all come together? So again, let's go back to the Bjornerud sort of realization. If you experience the city on a rainy day, it could be a pleasant shower or a flood. Lots of floods these days. It's hard to be meditative during a flood, but I think a slow drizzle really invites a meditative frame of mind, at least for me. If you can slow time down, bring a timefulness to your experience on a rainy day, then notice how the topography interacts with the rain. How does the rain change your experience of the city? Can you use that shower to perceive the intersection of personal circumstances, history, and deep history? You may see water go down at rain, but then where does it go from there? Watersheds are very important. Chennai is a great example of a city where literally building over watersheds has suddenly brought flooding as a major threat to the sustainability of the city. If we can experience the city as a watershed as much as a built environment, you're already bringing a form of geological thinking into your experience of the city. What's missing both in Bembe and in Bjornerud uh, is the multi-species approach that we are trying to bring here. Um, I think that's particularly important in cities because species are actually embodied time. In every species, including us, is etched the history of um, at least a few million years of evolution. One way to be geological is not just by looking at rocks and water, but also at trees and sparrows and monkeys, because at some level, the design of the city in time is also the design of the city in species. It's hard for me to tell whether these romantic considerations can ever be brought to the developer class. At the end of the day, if you're trying to build a housing colony and you want customers who will buy your flats, then you have to prioritize profits and short-term financial considerations. One of the most important ways in which money acts in our economy is as time, particularly because it allows you to buy other people's time, right? I give you money and you work for me. In that sense, there is no way to bring our everyday experience, our economic society into geological time without trying to reform money. I once had this thought that maybe we should replace rupees and dollars with carbon, make carbon the universal currency, because it's the one thing that is there from the beginning of life until today. Um, Map the economy in carbon, maybe we will be forced to take geology into account when we do economics. Again, that's a super romantic thought. Not sure if it'll ever happen, but there are a couple of places where people are seriously trying to do things like that. And we might explore some of those experiments in the future. But how do we actually make the city one which takes ecology and geology seriously? Um, that's where I want to end today's session. And maybe, Sartaj, you can introduce the experiment that will take us to Discord.
We'll have
Right.
time to go. I have a comment on the lecture, which I'll just take 5 minutes to say, and then I have a question for you. The comment is on the meditative mood that you said that rain puts you in, and it lets you tap into the geologic time scale. So I think for me, it comes from farming. I started growing food, and right now is the season where we're switching from summer crops to winter crops. I'm currently sowing the seeds. Doing that, I realize you only get so many iterations. Once a year is when you get to sow the seeds.
Yeah.
I've done that for 5 years now, and I don't know when I'm going to succeed. Each time it's such a struggle. But I think that is my way in on thinking on geological times. And the first reading that was from in the introductory week was from Soil. And he, in the book Soil, says that each civilization that plows their fields gets about 4,000 years of fertile soil. Right? That's how long it takes for your topsoil to get washed away. So you basically get 4,000 iterations. But it's a large enough time scale for nobody in their lifetime to realize what's happening. And even now, the very minor pushes that you see in climate or soil fertility are so subtle that you don't realize it. There is happening from the south to the north. But we don't have records of even the last 100 or 200 years to validate that. And yeah, that's my 2 bit on long-term thinking. Do you have something to say?
No, thank you for sharing that. Indeed, I feel like it's, of course, know the kind of impact, say, green revolution practices have done to Punjab. How can, and definitely farming, because of that yearly cycle, twice yearly in most parts of India, brings that geological mindset to the everyday.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important point.
So the question I have for you, you'll have 10 minutes to go, is you said we have to develop a deeper consciousness, right? And why do you say we should, like, why do we have to do that is my question to you.
You don't want to give a utilitarian answer, meaning that deeper consciousness will help us preserve our societies for the future, all the kind of standard things that you hear. You just go to any newspaper these days and somebody will be saying some version of this, which is, oh, unless you are more sustainable, blah, 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 you will destroy this, that, whatever. Right. And I feel like, yes, it's of course true. And maybe there is a reason to develop a deeper consciousness. But maybe the flip side is that it's when Mallory was asked why climb Mount Everest, and he said it's there. And I guess to me, the real reason to develop planetary consciousness is because it's there and we are there. It's possible. And I think that conjunction of need and technologically enabled possibility is an emerging combination. But really, it's there. That's my answer.
So I think with that, we can start today's exercise, which is the question, if you could go back 20 years in time, what would you have to change in your or in the urban locality that you're thinking of, so that today there are walking paths, cycling paths, if that was your main change that you want to see in your urban space, or if there are functional living water bodies and green spaces. Like, what would you have to change 20 years ago to make that happen today? I would suggest we go into Discord, and there are specific threads, like there's a thread for cycling paths and walking paths, and there's a thread for green spaces and water bodies. And
Hi, everyone, and welcome back. If you're still on Discord, maybe disengage a little bit. It was a lively discussion. The good thing about Discord is that it is a persistent space, so it'll be there even when the seminar is over and we can continue. So what I would like to do is go back to a question and answer session just to see if there are clarifications, things that people want to share. And I'm also thinking that maybe in the future we should switch the Discord bits and the Q&A bits, have the lecture be followed by the Q&A so that clarifications can be posed right away. Anshuman, I know you said you had some notes from earlier, and I thought you also have some notes. We could even start with those. Post your question or have the lectures in Discord itself. I think that, yeah, we could try it, but Zoom is made for webinars. It records it, it's connected. People are used to Zoom. So I think that's going to be a big lift. So I'm not going to force everybody to come to Discord to listen to a lecture.
Yeah, shall I
Yeah,
go?
go for it, Anshu. Yeah.
No, we were actually speaking just before the session began and we were discussing the readings. And I was confessing that I'm learning that I'm quite time illiterate, to use a term from the timefulness reading, because I really do struggle to make sense of these numbers of years with a number of zeros that I can't really wrap my head around. I found the reading to be quite an interesting entry point into geological thinking and geological time, because it brought together, on the one hand, looking at rocks and its various stratifications, together with our own tendencies of time denial that we seem to fall into so easily. So I just wanted to pick up on a couple of quotes from the reading. First one is, while the need for long range vision grows more acute, our attention spans are shrinking as we text and tweet in a hermetic, narcissistic now with a capital N. Like inexperienced but overconfident drivers, we accelerate into landscapes and ecosystems with no sense of their long established traffic patterns, and then react with surprise and indignation when we face the penalties for ignoring natural laws. I just like the turn of phrase which he used, made it quite accessible. In a different register, it reminded me of a couple of other things. One is a book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, the psychologist. He talks about how we often think of our lives as, he calls it a causa sui project, where we think of our own lives as like somehow bounded and some big personal project, when it's similar to the point that Rajesh and Sartaj were talking about, like how do you deal with insignificance, or and on the opposite end, how do you not get paralyzed by the immensity of existence. I wanted to recommend a podcast called Common Descent. I was listening to some episodes about the different kinds of crocodilians that have lived in the era of the mammals. They are hooved crocodilians, herbivorous crocodilians, and yeah, they have some cool episodes about also about thermoregulation. And yeah,
Maybe you can post the link to the podcast in the chat. But
into that.
yeah, thanks for sharing, man. Actually, thermoregulation makes me think that, again, just as water brings geology into the city, I think heat also does. And I think thinking of the city as a metabolic entity, there's a thriving literature in architecture, urban planning on urban metabolism. That might be, again, a way to. I mean, thermodynamics generally is a science that connects everyday experience to history to geology. You have some observations on the readings that you want to share? You're muted.
I was just going through the comments on Discord,
Hmm.
and some of them are really elaborate designs.
Did the full reading, the first chapter again. I'm not going to tell you where you can access. If you know where to download books, I can assure you that everything we have in the readings can be downloaded. It's a really well written book because it connects the three scales of personal life, history, and community history. Bjornrud actually does that well in the writing of the book itself. That she switches quite fluently from talking about her own personal experience from the initial anecdote about the snow to the next one, which is about her time in Norway, where she saw a landscape, again, a human created landscape, which is still adjacent to the non human. And then, of course, all the commentary on deep time. One question I have is that perhaps learning how to write in a way that brings these three pictures of time together is a good exercise of being timeful. It's a very concrete skill to cultivate, I think. Sanya has a very interesting comment here. Sanya, maybe you could say more about what's your learning there, right? Because you start by saying it reminded you about your city, but how does that story about your city open up geological time for you? Or maybe reading Bjornerud opens up your city for you. If you feel emboldened, we're happy to invite you to be a panelist and yeah. Do unmute yourself if you want to speak.
Hi, hello.
Please go ahead. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, when we talk about geology, before this is a very recent thing I did, like researching of ecological history and land use pattern of my city. So when I was reading about geological times, I tend to think in millions of years or billions of years when the earth was formed. But when I read these studies, I realized we have been on this island for maybe 2000 years. Human beings arrived through Africa because this island is next to the Sahara Desert. It put in perspective that maybe, maybe it's not millions of years. Even 2000 years can do like a lot of change to a place. So for me, it is a mindset problem more than a time problem because we should focus on planetary time. I do believe so and think in terms of geological time, it is fathomable. You can fathom it. I just think I'm lucky that I live on an island and I came across it, so it is more digestible for me. But when you live in India, it is difficult to digest it, like a continent that is so much older because the island I live on is 15 million old. It just came about 15 million years ago. So if you compare that way, that is why islands are very interesting when they do like research because it's like a mini continent. Changes happen a lot faster in comparison. Still millions of years. So in that way, I think it's a mindset problem at the end of the day. Instead of billions.
Thanks for sharing, Sanya. And that's an intriguing thought that we should all maybe go to islands to experience geological time better.
No, I don't think it is necessary to go to an island, but to read about it. I think it's just where I live. I have been reading about it, and I also have the pleasure to witness it. The city I live in started a tourism campaign. So it's been inhabited since 1960s. They made it into a touristic coastal city. And you can see the changes in the landscapes. Within those 60 years, you can see a lot of development. I drive around the mountains and I am always amazed by that there are roads here. I can't even explain because I'm like, how did they build a road here? And I would just think about it while driving around in the mountains because it's a mini continent at the end of the day. But it is possible to experience geological time, not in the 60 years, because I think the 60 years we are just experiencing historical time for the time being because we have some like issues in the island with human rights and housing. But I think maybe in 200 years or 300 years, we would see like even more changes in the geography of the island. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well, but I think reading about it makes a lot of, you can, especially around islands, if you read studies around them, you will like forests disappeared because of agricultural practices, species disappearing so fast. So that's all I have to say.
Yeah. Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you so much for that. Rajesh, do you have any last announcements or comments?
Nothing. So this week we did time. Next week we will do just to give you the logic of the seminar. The idea is that time is very important, but geology is an disciplinary insight into time that we normally don't have access to. So that's the big idea for today's seminar, right? That think geologically. Next week, we will move to space, but ecology will replace geology. In some sense, ecology is a spatial discipline. It looks at distributions of species, typically in space, though things like predator-prey relations have a temporal component to them also. The intuition of space that we get from ecology is what I'll be focusing on next week. We'll have dedicated sessions on ecology in a couple of weeks. Next week is ecology as a tool for thinking, and then 2-3 weeks from now, it'll be ecology as ecology. Yeah. A couple of hands raised. Panpsychism and planetary consciousness, that's a very long discussion. Maybe we'll do it over Discord. Panpsychism means everything is sentient, like rocks have consciousness. But whether we want to go that far or we are just thinking of planetary consciousness as a human way of knowing the earth, which is different from what we have today. Those are the two extremes. And Harshit, I think, has his hands raised. Harshit, if you want to type what you want to say to yourself, if you want to speak, please. All right. If that's the case, I guess we can close to, I think it's as good a time as any to finish. Thank you everyone for joining, and we'll continue the discussions on Discord. We might try posting a prompt in a few days so that there is a during the week activity that keeps the discussion going. So look out for something which will be sent to you both by email through the Google group, but then the actual discussion will happen on Discord. If you're uncomfortable with Discord or having a hard time getting to it, let us know. Okay. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.